I want to talk about what it means to sign a consent form when you want to live. To receive Lyfgenia, I signed documentation covering genetic data collection, sharing with research partners, and potential downstream uses of my biological material. I am an AI governance expert. Privacy, data rights, and surveillance are my professional territory. I read those consent forms with the same scrutiny I would bring to reviewing a corporate AI vendor contract. I flagged provisions. I consulted with people I trust. I asked questions that the standard intake process was not designed to accommodate, and then I signed. Because the alternative was declining a treatment with the potential to cure a disease that has defined the shape of my life. I want to be precise about what that moment was. It was not informed consent in any full meaning of that phrase. It was, quite simply, survival consent. Let me describe what the consent forms for gene therapy patients typically cover, because this is standard industry practice, not specific to my case. Biological sample collection. The treatment requires extensive sample collection. Bone marrow, blood samples at multiple points. Stem cells for processing. These samples become part of a research infrastructure that extends beyond my individual treatment. Research data sharing, the clinical outcomes, the biological markers, the longitudinal health data collected as part of the treatment and follow-up process. This data is shared with research partners, academic institutions, and potentially the pharmaceutical companies' research programs. The consent covers uses that are described in broad language rather than specific protocols. Future research use, provisions covering potential future uses of collected biological material and data that go beyond the immediate treatment. The language here is typically general enough to permit uses that had not been developed at the time of signing. Commercial research implications. In some cases, the results of research conducted using patient data and biological material can generate commercial value. The standard consent framework does not share that value with patients. I am not telling you these provisions are illegal. I am telling you they are standard practice. And that standard practice was not designed with Black patients' specific relationship to genetic data collection in mind. To understand why these consent forms carry particular weight for Black patients, you have to understand the history. Henrietta Lacks. Her cervical cancer cells were taken and cultured without her consent in 1951. Those cells, HeLa cells, became one of the most important biological research tools in modern medicine. They have been used in the development of the polio vaccine, cancer research, virology, and dozens of other critical medical advances. Henrietta Lacks received nothing. Her family received nothing. They were not informed. For decades, they did not know. The Tuskegee syphilis study. Between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service enrolled Black men with syphilis in a study and withheld effective treatment after it became available, continuing to study the progression of untreated disease in human subjects without their informed consent. These are not distant historical footnotes. They are within living memory. They are the reason the National Research Act and the Belmont Report exist. The regulatory framework for research ethics in the United States was built in direct response to Tuskegee. And yet, the consent architecture for gene therapy research in 2024 requires Black patients to trust institutions with their genetic material in ways that the history of those institutions' relationship to Black bodies makes profoundly complicated. The forms were signed by someone who understood exactly what history she was navigating. For organizations building or deploying AI in healthcare, particularly in genetic medicine, here is what this episode of the documentation means for you. Consent architecture matters. The standard consent forms used in gene therapy and genetic research were designed for the general population of research participants. They do not adequately address the specific historical context that shapes Black patients' relationship to genetic data collection. This is a design gap that has ethical implications and, increasingly, legal ones as genetic privacy legislation develops. Genetic data in AI is a special category. Under GDPR and the EU AI Act, genetic data is classified as sensitive personal data requiring heightened protection. The same protections do not uniformly apply under US law. Organizations building AI tools that incorporate genetic data should apply the higher standard proactively, not because regulation requires it, but because the populations most likely to contribute that data in healthcare research contexts are the populations with the most historical reason to distrust its use. The survival consent dynamic should be named and addressed. When patients are asked to make data sharing decisions during the consent process for life-saving treatment, the voluntariness of that consent is structurally compromised. Healthcare AI governance frameworks should acknowledge this dynamic and design around it. Next episode, the mental load. What the clinical literature doesn't count. What it costs to be a patient, in hours and in psychological weight, in a healthcare system that AI is mediating more efficiently without making more equitably. Full documentation on Substack, link below. Thank you for listening.